Thank you, Ben. And yeah, it's very nice to have heard this talk by Yizhou, because a lot of the issues that I will be talking about today are very related to what Yizhou talked about right before me, and also to a student poster by Lucas Convent yesterday. If you have seen that, he also addresses very similar issues of modularity and abstraction in languages with algebraic effects. So just for the few of us who have only recently joined us, let's recap quickly what the algebraic effects and handlers are and why we are so happy to have them. So the idea is to allow us to define a certain generalization of exceptions. So here we have an effect of an error with one operation raise that takes a unit and gives you anything, basically, right? And this is a well-known exception effect. And on the other side, on the right-hand side, we have an effect of a reader, which has one operation ask, and this is the reader monad known and loved by the Haskell crowd. And we can use these operations simply in the code, like so. And the control, basically just the handle construct that's wrapped around this string concatenation thing, is an evaluation context. So basically, the evaluation hits the ask, and the ask does not have a direct interpretation. So basically what happens is it looks up, like Yizhou said before, it looks up the next enclosing handler for this particular effect, finds the interpretation, and the interpretation says, well, insert Dave into the continuation from which you called and continue, right? So by the process of evaluation, we get the well-known quote, right? But that's not the only thing we can do, right? In this case, we've resumed precisely in that context. We didn't do anything once the string was evaluated. We just discarded the handler. We can do other stuff. We can simply check whether an exception was raised, like in the check handler here, which if there is an exception raised, returns true without calling continuation. And because of the type of the error, it could never call the continuation. Whereas in the case where the evaluation terminated with a value, it simply returns false, since no exception was raised. And the crucial selling point of algebraic effects is the fact that they combine really well. So there's no issue in reusing reader and exception together in one program. They basically can coexist nicely without any issues. So these usually come with type and effect systems, again, like what Yizhou talked about before. So in this case, we can say that if we apply foo to unit, we get something of a string type with an effect annotation that says what effects can be raised by this particular computation. In this case, error and the reader for the type string, reader with a return type of string. So the crucial points of the algebraic effects is that operations carry no predefined meaning, and this is the sorts of nice generalization of errors, of exceptions, right? When we have an exception, the meaning is provided by the evaluation context. The meaning of the particular exception, the exceptional behavior, is provided by the handle clause. And this is the sorts of natural generalization that took quite a while to get to, right? And these are often coupled with type and effect systems so that we can keep track of which effects may be raised by the computation. And this is very, very important because the pure fragment, the fragment with an unannotated arrow, is actually pure. Even if internally it performs some operations and handles them, because of the fact that it handles them, the entire computation outside can be viewed as pure. And this is very, very important because it gives us nice reasoning principles, equational reasoning, beta and eta, for the pure fragment. And in a very real way, it's the limited continuations made much more modular than the previous approaches. So I, for one, would not like to write programs using the limited control operators, and I'm quite happy writing programs using algebraic effects. So in this talk, we'd want to take languages with algebraic effects and move them towards more realistic structures. In particular, what we want to do is to, fulfill parts of Bob Harper's old adage that modularity matters most, and extend our languages with algebraic effects with existential quantification, with modules, basically. And the use case on which I would like to present this is the disjoint sets data structure. So this is the slightly buttered version of a ML signature for disjoint sets, right? So we have a set type constructor and 3 operations. We can define a new set with representative of type A. We can call a find operation, which finds the representative of a set. And we can unite 2 sets, provided we know how to unite the representatives. Now, of course, this would not serve as a signature in a language where the arrow, unannotated arrow, is a pure arrow, right? The union is the best example. There's simply not enough pure functions of this type. So what can we do? Well, we can introduce an abstract effect to this signature, or an abstract effect constructor, all right? And now these operations look much more in line with the algebraic effect sort of way of thinking. So both new, find, and union now have a abstract union find effect. And we're not saying how this effect is defined, right? It's abstract, its implementation is unknown. But what we can see here is that there is some effect like that. And this is almost what we want. It's almost what we want because we still require the argument of the union to be pure, which is simply not the case in most applications of union find, like unification problems, for instance. So what we can say here is we can say this should work for any effectful function union. So we can add an annotation here that says, well, any effect here goes, really. And this effect should then appear as part of the effect of the entire union computation. Now, this is a bit weird in the sense that union does not look anymore as a sort of operation of an algebraic effect, because an operation of an algebraic effect simply raises this one particular effect, like new did, and new or find do, and like ask or error did in the previous case, right? So here, it's a bit different, and the difference comes from the fact that we expect the call site of the union function to be the precise point, the call site of the argument of the union to be where the union is called, right? So this would be quite a nice specification, but sadly it would not be particularly useful. We would be able to write programs that do a union find effect, but we would never be able to get rid of it. And we do want to get rid of it. In particular, if we wanted to implement, I don't know, a unification algorithm, we would want to give a pure interface to the unification. After all, the unification problem as such is not effectful by itself. So what we need is we need to provide an abstract handler. So simply a value which can take any computation that performs some effect E, returns some type V, and performs a unification effect. And handle UF can simply run this computation and get rid of the union find effect in some way. Abstract, of course. So this would be nice for the usual reasons, right? This would allow large-scale modularity in the context of a language with algebraic effects. It would guarantee representation independence for effects. So we could replace one specification of an effect with another specification of effect if we found a better implementation for it. It definitely does limit handlers that clients can use. In a certain way, it provides a proper definition for the I/O effect that's used in most of the effectful programming languages, right? Which generally cannot be handled because it's got to be propagated to the runtime system, right? And one interesting aspect is that it seems, at least on the surface, to be more expressive. And the way that the additional expressivity works is tied to the fact that these higher order parameters to what would otherwise look like operations, the call sites of these arguments matters, and it can be expressed more. Well, it can be more expressive in this sense, right? So in the paper, we're not considering a proper module system. We're considering adding existential types or existential quantification over effects to a simple calculus. Of course, we're aware this is not a proper module system, but it suffices for our purposes. It suffices for very simplistic functors and modules, and we can work with that as a experimental implementation, let's say. So it's all fun, but aren't there any problems related to existential quantification over effects? And of course, there are. And these problems are intimately tied to what Yijo and Lucas talked about before me. So if we consider, again, the simple effect of reader, and now on the left-hand side here, we have some abstract effect E with an operation or with an abstract function that has a very similar type to reader, right? To the ask operation. In particular, ask for a reader of int has exactly analogous type to the type on the left-hand side. So of course, we could call ask and myask, and this computation would have two effects, E and reader int. And now, if we handle ask, the expected outcome would be that the effect raised by myask is still propagated outwards, right? It should never be caught by the handler. But what happens if E is instantiated to precisely reader int and myask is instantiated precisely to ask? Well, if we simply erased the types at this point, ask would get captured, right? If we simply substitute here, like you do with existential types usually, ask would get captured. So again, it's another instance of this leaky abstraction. If anything, it's a little bit more dire and a little bit more complex because of the more complex type system that we're in. So how can we solve it? One way would be to limit the existential quantification in a way that sometimes we do with universal quantification, particularly for row polymorphism for records. Another way would be to freshen the effects that are packed as an existential effect. But these are not particularly satisfactory. So what we did in this paper is to extend effects or the calculus with effect coercions. And Yijo mentioned on his very last slide that last year at Popple we've introduced this lift operation that allowed us to pretend that an expression had more effects than it actually did in a way that's in places where it would be incompatible with simply sub-effecting. So what we did then was we used this lift to allow us to reason parametrically in a language with algebraic effect. And in this paper, we moved from simply having a lift operation to having a whole language of effect coercions that allow us to rearrange rows in ways that would be otherwise not allowed. Now, these consist of two atomic coercions, lift and swap, which one of these can add effects to the row, and the other can exchange two effects inside the row. And then simply, once we have such a coercion, we can apply it to an expression and coerce one row into another. So the important bit here is that these coercions have semantic content. They are not just live on the type level. They do not get erased with the types. They still live in the semantics. They still live in an abstract machine. And they are used to prevent handlers from being accessed. Like in this case, where my ask is wrapped in a lift of reader int, simply so that it could survive in the instance that it's instantiated to ask. It could still survive past the first handler. And of course, if it uses other effects rather than rather than reader, then it will still pass through ask without problems because it's just a different effect. Now, why do we need swap, though? Particularly since in last year's paper, we've expressed swap using simply lift, right? I mean, it was a thing then. So it turns out that this is not the case here. In this language, we cannot express swap using int because we needed to use handling construct in order to express swap. So we only could express swap because we always knew the implementations of the effects. And since here we have effects which do not carry their definitions with them, we cannot use this. So there's more in the paper. There's a full description of abstract effects and coercions that allow us to give a sound semantics. There's local declarations of effects that we consider, which again add more modularity, more sorts of grown-up effect language into the mix. And we provide type erasure and abstract machine to make sure that the whole setting makes sense. Finally, we have a largish case study of unification using abstract effects and handlers, which I think is quite interesting. So if you want to read it, I will be happy. But the point is, in the future, we would like to hide coercions. The calculus that we consider, we treat as a sort of intermediate language. We wouldn't want people to actually see these coercions. And this, for us, is a work in progress. One possible direction would be effect instances. The other possible direction would definitely be looking into tunneling and seeing whether it scales to abstract case, like we consider here. And we also have an experimental language called Helium that you're all very welcome to try to use and tell us what you think. So thank you. Are there any questions?
So the problem I see with coercion inference is that there may be two choices of which coercion to infer. Do you have an answer to how to deal with that?
Yeah, so At present, the usual thing is that there's one that's much more common than the other. And in the current implementation of Helium, which doesn't treat coercion inference particularly sensibly, it tries, but we haven't studied it deeply. What you do then is you add enough effect annotations. So most of the time you don't write anything, and some of the time you write some type annotations. It's not particularly satisfactory, but that's what we have for the moment.
We have time for one more question.
So you talked about how to infer or remove the coercion, like annotations, and you mentioned sub-effecting, and there's also another more static way of having a row polymorphism, extensible effect kind of thing. But I also saw that those coercions have dynamic semantic meaning. So
yeah,
what are the subtleties on there? Do you have to choose sub-effecting and cannot do the row polymorphism or kind of?
So there is row polymorphism involved, and there is some sub-effecting that deals with the row polymorphism. Part of the whole thing with coercions is that when you have these open rows, so-called, or rows that finish with a type variable, you are not allowed to sub-effect properly. You are not allowed to add additional effects in front of these. And this is why you have to use lift in such a case. So this is what we explored also in last year's paper. So
okay.
Hope this helped.
Okay, so it's time to move on to the next speaker. Let's thank